66 million years ago, Earth was a different world entirely. The sun rose each morning over vast forests of towering conifers and sprawling fern prairies, casting long shadows across landscapes where massive creatures moved with quiet purpose. Triceratops herds grazed peacefully in coastal plains, their three-horned skulls glinting in the warm light as they stripped leaves from cycad bushes. In the distance, the ground trembled slightly under the measured footsteps of a lone Tyrannosaurus, not hunting, but simply walking through its territory with the casual confidence of an apex predator in a world that had belonged to dinosaurs for over 160 million years. The climate was gentle then, warmer than our modern Earth by several degrees. There were no ice caps at the poles, and palm trees grew in what we now call Alaska. Shallow seas covered much of North America, creating a vast inland waterway that stretched from the Gulf of Mexico nearly to the Arctic Ocean. The air was thick and humid, rich with oxygen and carbon dioxide, perfect for sustaining the enormous metabolisms of creatures that could weigh as much as a dozen elephants. This was the late Cretaceous period, and life had never been more abundant or diverse. But on one particular morning, as the sun climbed toward its zenith over what is now Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula, something appeared in the sky that had been traveling through space for millions of years. A mountain-sized asteroid, roughly 10 kilometers across, was about to end this peaceful world forever. Not with a single moment of destruction, but with a slow, inexorable collapse that would unfold over months and years, driven not by the impact itself, but by the climate catastrophe that followed. The asteroid struck Earth traveling at 20 kilometers per second, faster than any bullet ever fired. The impact created an explosion equivalent to billions of atomic bombs detonating simultaneously, carving out what we now call the Chicxulub crater, a scar in the Earth's crust 200 kilometers wide and 30 kilometers deep. But this moment of destruction, as catastrophic as it was, lasted only minutes. The real story of the dinosaurs' extinction begins in the hours and days that followed, when the impact set in motion a series of climate changes that would slowly strangle the life out of their world. Within hours of the impact, something unprecedented began happening to Earth's atmosphere. The asteroid had struck a particularly unfortunate location, hitting sedimentary rocks rich in gypsum and sulfur compounds. As these materials vaporized in the tremendous heat of the collision, they were blasted high into the stratosphere, along with billions of tons of pulverized rock and debris. The sky began to change color, shifting from blue to an ominous gray, then to an unnatural darkness that would persist for months. The fine particles suspended in the atmosphere were exactly the right size to cause maximum damage to Earth's climate systems. Silicate dust particles measuring between 0.8 and 8.0 micrometers hung in the air like a planetary shroud, each grain too small to fall quickly back to Earth, but large enough to block and scatter incoming sunlight. Scientists estimate that these particles reduce the amount of solar radiation reaching Earth's surface by more than 50%, creating conditions that would persist for over a decade. As the dust and debris circulated around the globe, carried by high-altitude winds and atmospheric currents, they were joined by sulfuric acid aerosols, formed when the vaporized gypsum reacted with water vapor in the stratosphere. These acid droplets created thick, persistent clouds similar to those that shroud Venus, further darkening the skies and beginning a process of global cooling that would drive Earth's average temperature down by as much as 15 degrees Celsius. The impact winter had begun, and with it, the slow death of the dinosaurs. For the massive herbivores that had dominated Cretaceous landscapes, the first sign of trouble came not from the cold, but from their empty stomachs. Plants, the foundation of every terrestrial food web, require sunlight for photosynthesis. As the skies darkened and remained dark day after day, week after week, the process that had sustained plant life for billions of years simply stopped. ferns withered in the perpetual twilight. Mighty conifers, some of which had lived for centuries, began to shed their needles as their internal chemistry failed. Flowering plants, still relatively new to Earth's ecosystems, found their colourful blooms closing forever as they exhausted their stored energy reserves. The collapse began slowly, almost imperceptibly at first. A hadrosaur herd might wander for days searching for fresh vegetation, finding only brown, dying plants that provided little nutrition. Their complex digestive systems, evolved over millions of years to extract energy from tough plant fibers, now worked overtime to process increasingly poor quality food. Mothers could no longer produce enough milk for their young. Adults began losing weight despite spending every waking hour foraging. Meanwhile, in the oceans, a parallel catastrophe was unfolding with even greater speed. Marine food webs depend on microscopic phytoplankton, tiny organisms that drift near the surface and use photosynthesis to convert sunlight and dissolve nutrients into the energy that feeds everything from small fish to massive marine reptiles. As the impact winter darkened the seas, these crucial organisms began dying en masse. The base of the marine food web simply vanished, creating a cascade of starvation that would ultimately kill off the giant marine reptiles of the Mesozoic. The long-necked plesiosaurs, the massive mosasaurs, and countless species of ammonites and other mollusks. The acid rain that accompanied the impact winter added another layer of environmental stress. Sulfuric acid formed in the stratosphere eventually fell back to Earth as precipitation with a pH low enough to damage plant tissues and alter soil chemistry. Rivers and lakes became acidic, killing freshwater organisms and further reducing the available food sources for surviving land animals. The chemical composition of seawater changed as well, affecting the ability of marine organisms to build shells and skeletons from calcium carbonate. As weeks turned to months, the full horror of the impact winter became apparent. Earth had become a frozen, poisoned world where the normal rhythms of life had simply stopped. Temperatures plummeted not just for a few days or weeks, but for years. Ice began forming in regions that had been tropical just months before. The great herds of herbivorous dinosaurs, already weakened by months of poor nutrition, now faced the additional challenge of surviving in a climate colder than any their species had ever experienced. But it wasn't just the cold that killed them. It was the complete breakdown of the energy systems that had sustained life on Earth for hundreds of millions of years. Without photosynthesis, there was no way for new energy to enter terrestrial ecosystems. Plants could survive for a while on stored starches and sugars, but these reserves were finite. When they ran out, the plants died. And when the plants died, everything that depended on them followed. The large herbivorous dinosaurs were among the first to succumb. Species like Triceratops and Edmontosaurus, which required enormous quantities of plant matter every day to fuel their massive bodies, found themselves in a world where such food simply no longer existed. Their smaller relatives might survive a bit longer on seeds, nuts, and other concentrated energy sources, but even these would eventually run out. Carnivorous dinosaurs faced their own unique set of challenges. Initially, the impact winter might have seemed like a bonanza for predators and scavengers. There were suddenly vast numbers of dead and dying animals available as food, but this abundance was temporary and ultimately illusory. As the herbivore populations collapsed, the carnivores found themselves in a world with an ever-dwindling supply of prey. A Tyrannosaurus rex, requiring perhaps 300 pounds of meat per week to survive, might initially feast on the carcasses of animals that had died from cold and starvation. But as these carcasses were consumed or decomposed beyond edibility, the great predators faced the same fate as their prey. Their enormous size, which had been an advantage in a world of abundant food, now became a liability in a world of scarcity. Some dinosaurs might have survived longer than others. Smaller species with lower metabolic requirements could potentially endure on limited food sources for extended periods. Those that lived near rivers or coasts might have access to fish, insects, or other organisms that were less affected by the collapse of terrestrial plant communities. But even these survivors faced an increasingly hostile environment as the impact winter dragged on month after month, year after year. The irony of the extinction was that the asteroid impact itself probably killed relatively few dinosaurs directly. The massive earthquakes, tsunamis, and thermal radiation from falling debris certainly caused immediate casualties, but these were localized effects. The vast majority of dinosaurs were still alive in the days and weeks following the impact. They died slowly, over the course of months and years, as their world gradually became uninhabitable. This slow death was perhaps more cruel than a quick extinction would have been. Dinosaur parents watched their offspring waste away from hunger. Ancient creatures that had survived ice ages and volcanic catastrophes found themselves unable to adapt to a world where the very foundations of life had been swept away. The rulers of Earth for over 160 million years were slowly, inexorably starving to death in a world that had become alien to them almost overnight. Overnight, the darkness persisted for months, but the dying lasted much longer. As the impact winter tightened its grip on Earth, the planet entered a phase of environmental collapse that would stretch across years, each season bringing new horrors for the surviving dinosaurs. The fine silicate dust that had been blasted into the stratosphere proved to be remarkably persistent, with particles of just the right size to remain suspended in the upper atmosphere for over a decade. Unlike the brief darkness of a solar eclipse or even a massive volcanic eruption, this was a sustained blackout that fundamentally altered the chemistry of life itself. The temperature drop was not uniform across the globe, creating a patchwork of dying ecosystems. In what had been the warm, humid forests of North America, ice began forming on rivers that had never frozen in the 100 million years since dinosaurs first evolved. The great inland sea that had divided the continent began to cool rapidly, its surface temperature plummeting by 7 degrees Celsius within the first few years. For marine reptiles like the massive mosasaurs, adapted to warm tropical waters, this cooling was as deadly as poison. On land, the temperature changes created their own cascade of problems. Many dinosaur species had evolved in climates that remained relatively stable for millions of years. Their physiology, their behavior, their very DNA was calibrated to a world that no longer existed. The great sauropods, with their long necks and massive bodies, had circulatory systems designed for warm weather. As temperatures dropped below freezing across much of their range, their hearts struggled to pump blood through their enormous frames. Some may have attempted to migrate toward the equator, following ancient instincts, but they found no refuge there. The impact winter was global, and even the tropics had become cold and dark. The acid rain that accompanied this cooling added a particularly insidious element to the environmental catastrophe. When sulfur compounds vaporized by the impact reached the stratosphere, they combined with water vapor to form sulfuric acid clouds that would persist for years. These clouds not only blocked additional sunlight, but eventually fell back to Earth as precipitation acidic enough to burn plant tissues and poison soil. Rivers and lakes became chemical weapons against life itself, their pH levels dropping to points that would kill fish, amphibians, and any dinosaur desperate enough to drink from them. For the plant communities that had sustained dinosaur ecosystems for so long, the acid rain represented a final insult, added to the injury of perpetual darkness. Conifers that might have survived the cold and lack of sunlight for months found their needle-like leaves being slowly dissolved by acidic precipitation. Ferns, among the most ancient and resilient plant groups on Earth, watched their fronds turn brown and crumble as soil chemistry shifted beyond their tolerance. Even the hardy cycads, which had fed herbivorous dinosaurs since the Triassic period, began dying as their root systems were poisoned by increasingly acidic groundwater. The marine environment faced its own unique set of challenges as the impact winter progressed. Ocean acidification occurred rapidly as sulfuric acid from the atmosphere dissolved into seawater, lowering the pH of entire ocean basins. This chemical change made it nearly impossible for marine organisms to build and maintain shells or skeletons made of calcium carbonate. Ammonites, which had ruled the seas for nearly 400 million years, found their spiral shells dissolving in the increasingly acidic water. The massive marine reptiles that fed on these shelled creatures watched their primary food sources simply vanish from the ecosystem. But perhaps the most devastating aspect of the marine collapse was the complete shutdown of primary productivity in the oceans. Phytoplankton, the microscopic organisms that form the base of all marine food webs, require sunlight for photosynthesis, just as much as land plants do. As the impact winter darkened the seas, these tiny but crucial organisms began dying en masse. Within months, the ocean surface layers that had teemed with life became biological deserts. The effects rippled up through the food web with mathematical precision. Without phytoplankton, there could be no zooplankton. Without zooplankton, there could be no small fish. Without small fish, the great marine predators had nothing to eat. The collapse of marine ecosystems was actually more rapid and complete than the death of terrestrial environments. On land, there were at least some seeds, nuts, and other stored energy sources that could sustain life for months or even years. In the oceans, when the phytoplankton died, there was nothing to replace them. The great marine reptiles of the Mesozoic, creatures like the long-necked plesiosaurs that had dominated ocean ecosystems for over 100 million years, faced starvation in a matter of months rather than years. As the impact winter entered its second and third years, the surviving dinosaurs found themselves in a world that bore no resemblance to the one their ancestors had known. The great herds of hadrosaurs that had once migrated across continental distances, following seasonal patterns of plant growth, now wandered aimlessly through frozen wastelands where no plants grew at all. Their complex social structures, evolved over millions of years, began to break down as family groups were separated in desperate searches for food. Adults abandoned their young when they could no longer produce milk or find enough food to share. The elaborate mating displays and territorial behaviors that had defined dinosaur societies became meaningless luxuries in a world focused entirely on survival. The larger carnivorous dinosaurs faced perhaps the most ironic fate of all. Species like Tyrannosaurus rex, which had evolved to be the ultimate predators in ecosystems abundant with large prey, now found themselves in a world where their very success had become their downfall. Their massive size, which had allowed them to dominate other predators and take down enormous herbivores, now required enormous amounts of food that simply no longer existed. A single adult T-Rex needed to consume hundreds of pounds of meat every week to survive. In the early stages of the extinction, when herbivore carcasses were still relatively common, this might have been possible. But as these food sources were consumed or decomposed beyond edibility, even the mighty tyrannosaurs faced slow starvation. Some of the smaller carnivorous dinosaurs might have survived longer by adapting their diets to include insects, small mammals, and other creatures that were less dependent on the collapsed plant communities. But even these resourceful survivors faced diminishing returns as the impact winter progressed. Insect populations crashed as the plants they depended on died. Small mammal populations, while more resilient than dinosaurs, were also severely reduced by the environmental catastrophe. The few dinosaurs that managed to find alternative food sources were buying time, not salvation. The psychological stress of the prolonged environmental crisis may have been as deadly as the physical challenges. Many dinosaur species had evolved complex social behaviors and communication systems that depended on stable environmental conditions. The constant darkness disrupted natural circadian rhythms, affecting sleep patterns, hormone production, and reproductive cycles. The persistent cold and hunger created chronic stress that would have weakened immune systems, making survivors more vulnerable to diseases and parasites. For creatures that had evolved in stable, abundant ecosystems, the impact winter represented not just a physical challenge, but a complete breakdown of the natural order they had known for millions of generations. Yet even as the dinosaurs slowly died, other forms of life were quietly adapting to the new reality. Small mammals, with their lower metabolic requirements and more flexible diets, found ways to survive in burrows and protected spaces where temperatures remained more stable. Many mammalian species were already semi-aquatic or burrowing, lifestyles that provided additional protection from the environmental extremes. Their small size allowed them to survive on limited food sources, and their warm-blooded metabolism, while energy-intensive, also allowed them to remain active in the cold conditions that were paralyzing the cold-blooded reptiles. Birds, the direct descendants of theropod dinosaurs, demonstrated the survival advantages of flight and small body size. While many bird species certainly went extinct during the impact winter, those that survived were able to travel vast distances in search of food and suitable habitats. Their ability to fly allowed them to access resources that were unavailable to ground-bound creatures, and their relatively small size meant they required far less food than their dinosaur relatives. In many ways, the surviving birds represented the continuation of the dinosaur lineage, adapted to a world that could no longer support their larger cousins. The plant communities that would eventually recover from the impact winter were those with the most resilient reproductive strategies. Seeds and spores designed by millions of years of evolution to survive harsh conditions lay dormant in the soil, waiting for better times. Ferns, which could reproduce both sexually through spores and vegetatively through underground rhizomes, proved particularly resilient. When sunlight finally began to penetrate the atmosphere again after years of darkness, these hardy plants would be among the first to recolonize the devastated landscapes. But for the non-avian dinosaurs, recovery was not an option. Their evolutionary strategies, so successful for over 160 million years, had left them particularly vulnerable to the type of global environmental collapse triggered by the asteroid impact. Their large body sizes, which had allowed them to dominate Mesozoic ecosystems, required abundant food resources that were simply no longer available. Their specialized diets, whether herbivorous or carnivorous, could not adapt quickly enough to the radically altered food webs of the impact winter world. The death of the dinosaurs was not a single event, but a process that unfolded over years, driven not by the violence of the initial impact, but by the slow strangulation of the environmental systems that had sustained them. As the impact winter finally began to wane, after 3 to 5 years of reduced sunlight and freezing temperatures, those few dinosaurs that had managed to survive the initial catastrophe faced yet another challenge. The dust and acid clouds that had plunged Earth into an artificial ice age were finally beginning to settle out of the atmosphere. But their departure would trigger an environmental reversal almost as dramatic as the impact winter itself. The same asteroid impact that had initially cooled the planet had also injected massive quantities of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere through the vaporization of carbonate rocks and the burning of organic matter. As the dust and sulfur compounds that had been blocking sunlight finally cleared from the stratosphere, this greenhouse gas began to assert its influence on Earth's climate. The planet that had been locked in an artificial winter for years was about to experience a dramatic swing toward extreme warming that would persist for hundreds of thousands of years. This climate whiplash, from severe cooling to intense warming, represented the final blow to dinosaur ecosystems that had already been devastated by years of environmental stress. The few dinosaur populations that had managed to survive the impact, winter now faced rising temperatures, changing precipitation patterns, and continued ecosystem instability that would prevent any meaningful recovery of their populations. The slow death of the dinosaurs was entering its final phase, driven not by cold and darkness, but by heat and the continued breakdown of the environmental systems they depended on. The atmospheric carbon dioxide that had been building up during the impact winter years now began its own deadly work. Scientists estimate that CO2 levels, which had been around 350 to 500 parts per million before the impact, suddenly spiked to over 2,300 parts per million as vaporized limestone and organic carbon from the impact site mixed with gases from global wildfires. This represented one of the most dramatic increases in atmospheric greenhouse gases in Earth's history, and its effects would be felt for millennia to come as the dust finally settled and weak sunlight began filtering through the clearing atmosphere. Earth's surface started absorbing solar radiation again for the first time in years. But now, instead of that energy radiating back into space as it had for millions of years, it was trapped by the thickened atmosphere, heavy with carbon dioxide. The planet that had been frozen in perpetual winter began warming rapidly, with global average temperatures rising by 5 degrees Celsius within the first 60,000 years after the impact. In some regions, the warming was even more extreme, with temperatures in North Africa rising by 5 degrees and areas off the Australian coast experiencing increases of up to 10 degrees. This dramatic warming created an entirely new set of challenges for any dinosaurs that had managed to survive the impact winter. The few remaining herbivore populations, already weakened by years of malnutrition and environmental stress, now faced rapidly changing vegetation patterns as plant communities struggled to adapt to the new climate regime. The conifers and ferns that had begun to recover during the final stages of the impact winter found themselves stressed once again as temperatures soared beyond their tolerance ranges. Many plant species that had survived the cold and darkness could not adapt quickly enough to the sudden heat, creating yet another wave of ecosystem collapse. The ocean systems that had been devastated by the impact winter now faced additional challenges from the warming climate. Sea surface temperatures rose rapidly, creating thermal stratification that prevented the mixing of nutrient-rich deep waters with the surface layers where marine life was trying to recover. The warmer waters held less dissolved oxygen, creating vast dead zones where even the hardiest marine organisms could not survive. The few marine reptile species that had endured the impact, winter now found their ocean habitats becoming increasingly hostile as water chemistry continued to change. But perhaps most significantly, the rapid climate change prevented the establishment of stable ecosystems that might have supported dinosaur recovery. Just as plant communities began to re-establish themselves, temperature spikes would stress them beyond their limits. Just as animal populations started to grow, changing precipitation patterns would alter their habitat conditions once again. The environmental instability that characterized the post-impact world made it nearly impossible for large, specialized creatures like non-avian dinosaurs to re-establish sustainable populations. The warming phase also brought with it changes in atmospheric circulation patterns that further destabilize regional climates. The intense heating of the atmosphere created more powerful storm systems and altered the paths of ocean currents that had remained stable for millions of years. Monsoon patterns shifted, bringing torrential rains to some regions while creating new deserts in others. For dinosaur populations that might have found refuge in particular geographic areas during the impact winter, these changing weather patterns represented yet another challenge to their survival. During this period of rapid warming, the few remaining dinosaur species faced competition from organisms that were better adapted to the unstable environmental conditions. Small mammals, which had survived the impact winter in burrows and protected spaces, began expanding rapidly into ecological niches that had been vacated by extinct dinosaur species. Their higher reproductive rates and more flexible dietary requirements allowed them to take advantage of new opportunities much more quickly than the surviving dinosaurs could respond. The mammalian survivors of the extinction event were not large or particularly impressive by Mesozoic standards. Most were small creatures, comparable in size to modern rats and mice, with simple teeth adapted for eating insects, seeds, and other readily available food sources. But their modest requirements and adaptable lifestyles positioned them perfectly to thrive in the chaotic post-impact environment. While dinosaurs needed stable, abundant ecosystems to support their complex life cycles and energy requirements, Mammals could survive and reproduce in the marginal habitats that characterize the recovering world. Bird populations, being dinosaurs themselves, offer crucial insights into why some dinosaur lineages survived while others perished. The birds that made it through the extinction event were generally small ground-dwelling species that could survive on seeds, insects, and other food sources that remained available during the environmental crisis. Their ability to fly allowed them to travel long distances in search of suitable habitats, and their high metabolic rates, while energy expensive, also allowed them to remain active in conditions that would have incapacitated cold-blooded reptiles. The plant communities that emerged during the warming phase were fundamentally different from those that had supported Cretaceous dinosaur ecosystems. Flowering plants, which had been diversifying throughout the Cretaceous period, proved particularly resilient to the environmental upheaval. Their rapid reproductive cycles and diverse pollination strategies allowed them to recolonize damaged landscapes more quickly than the slower-growing conifers that had dominated dinosaur habitats. The forests that began to regrow in the post-impact world were increasingly dominated by deciduous trees and flowering shrubs rather than the conifer and fern communities that had fed the great herbivorous dinosaurs. These changing plant communities could not support the specialized feeding requirements of many dinosaur species. Large sauropods had evolved complex digestive systems specifically adapted to processing tough, fibrous plant material like conifer needles and fern fronds. The new flowering plant communities, while more nutritious in some ways, required different digestive strategies that the surviving sauropods could not develop quickly enough. Herbivorous dinosaurs that had spent millions of years co-evolving with specific plant species found themselves in a world where their preferred food sources were either extinct or drastically reduced in abundance. The predatory dinosaurs faced their own unique challenges as the food web reorganized around smaller, more adaptable species. The massive tyrannosaurs and other large carnivores had evolved to hunt enormous herbivorous dinosaurs in environments where such prey was abundant. As herbivore populations collapsed and the surviving plant eaters became smaller and more scattered, these apex predators found themselves over-specialized for a type of hunting that was no longer possible. Their enormous size, which had been an advantage when tackling multi-ton prey, became a liability in a world where the largest available prey animals were often no bigger than a small deer. The few carnivorous dinosaur species that survived longest were likely smaller, more generalized predators that could adapt their hunting strategies to target birds, mammals, and other small prey. But even these adaptable species faced increasing competition from other predators that were better suited to the new environmental conditions. Early carnivorous mammals, while much smaller than the dinosaur predators, were warm-blooded, highly active, and capable of hunting effectively in the variable temperatures and lighting conditions of the post-impact world. As the warming phase continued, lasting for approximately 100,000 years, the environmental instability prevented the re-establishment of the large, complex ecosystems that had characterized the Cretaceous period. Instead of the vast herds of herbivorous dinosaurs that had migrated across continental distances following seasonal vegetation patterns, the post-impact world was characterized by smaller, more localized populations of animals that could survive on limited resources in unpredictable environments. The marine recovery during this period was equally dramatic and equally unfavorable to the surviving dinosaur lineages. As ocean temperatures rose and circulation patterns reorganized, new types of marine ecosystems began to emerge, but these were dominated by smaller, more rapidly reproducing species rather than the massive marine reptiles that had ruled Cretaceous seas. The few marine reptile species that had survived the initial impact and the following impact winter could not compete effectively with the new marine communities that were evolving to take advantage of the changed ocean conditions. freshwater environments, which had provided some refuge for dinosaurs during the worst of the impact winter, also underwent significant changes during the warming phase. Rising temperatures and altered precipitation patterns changed river flow regimes and lake levels across the globe. Many of the wetland environments that had supported diverse dinosaur communities dried up entirely, while others became too warm or chemically altered to support the surviving dinosaur populations. The carbon cycle disruption that drove this prolonged warming period created feedback effects that further destabilized global climate systems, as permafrost melted in polar regions that had frozen during the impact winter. Additional carbon stored in soils was released into the atmosphere, amplifying the warming trend. Vegetation patterns shifted so rapidly that plant communities could not establish the stable root systems and soil chemistry needed to sequester carbon effectively, preventing the natural processes that might have eventually stabilized atmospheric CO2 levels. Ocean chemistry remained unstable throughout this period as well, with pH levels fluctuating as the marine carbon cycle struggled to re-establish equilibrium. The acidification that had begun during the impact winter continued in various forms as the excess atmospheric carbon dioxide dissolved into seawater. This ongoing chemical instability prevented the recovery of shell-building marine organisms and maintained the disrupted state of ocean food webs that had begun with the collapse of phytoplankton populations years earlier. For the surviving dinosaur populations, perhaps the most devastating aspect of this prolonged environmental crisis was its duration. A single catastrophic event, even one as severe as the initial asteroid impact, might have been survivable for species with sufficient genetic diversity and adaptive capacity. But the environmental instability lasted for hundreds of thousands of years, far longer than the typical lifespan of individual dinosaur populations, and much longer than the time required for evolutionary adaptations to develop. Each generation of surviving dinosaurs faced slightly different environmental conditions than their parents had experienced. Young animals could not learn successful survival strategies from adults because the environmental rules kept changing. Traditional migration routes became useless as climate patterns shifted. Seasonal behaviors that had been refined over millions of years of evolution no longer matched the environmental cues that triggered them. The accumulated wisdom of dinosaur societies, passed down through generations of successful adaptation, became irrelevant in a world that bore no resemblance to the one in which that knowledge had been developed. The psychological and social stress of living in such an unstable environment may have been as important as the physical challenges in driving the final extinction of non-avian dinosaurs. Many dinosaur species had evolved complex social structures and communication systems that depended on predictable environmental conditions and abundant resources. The breakdown of these social systems would have reduced reproductive success, increased vulnerability to predators, and eliminated the cooperative behaviors that had allowed dinosaurs to thrive for so long. As the warming period peaked and then gradually began to stabilize, roughly 100,000 years after the initial impact, the world that emerged was fundamentally different from the one the asteroid had destroyed. The great conifer forests were gone, replaced by deciduous woodlands dominated by flowering plants. The vast herds of herbivorous dinosaurs had vanished, their ecological niches now occupied by small mammals that would eventually evolve into the diverse array of herbivores that would characterize the Cenozoic era. The ocean ecosystems had been completely reorganized around new groups of marine organisms adapted to the changed chemical and physical conditions of post-impact seas. The massive marine reptiles that had dominated Cretaceous oceans were extinct, their roles as top predators eventually taken over by marine mammals that would not appear for millions of years. Even the microscopic plankton communities that formed the base of marine food webs were composed of different species than those that had supported Mesozoic marine ecosystems. In this new world, the evolutionary advantages that had made dinosaurs successful for over 160 million years became liabilities. Their large size, specialized diets, complex life cycles, and dependence on stable environmental conditions were all poorly suited to the chaotic, rapidly changing conditions of the post-impact Earth. The few dinosaur species that managed to survive into this new era found themselves increasingly marginalized, unable to compete effectively with the smaller, more adaptable organisms that were inheriting the Earth. The final extinctions of non-avian dinosaur lineages probably occurred not through dramatic die-offs, but through the gradual failure of populations to maintain themselves in an environment that no longer supported their basic biological requirements. Reproductive rates may have declined, as stressed adults could not find adequate nutrition for successful breeding. Juvenile survival rates likely plummeted as young animals faced environmental conditions their species had never encountered before. Genetic diversity was probably lost as small, isolated populations became increasingly inbred and vulnerable to local environmental fluctuations. By the time Earth's climate began to stabilize in something resembling a new equilibrium, roughly 300,000 years after the asteroid impact, the age of non-avian dinosaurs was over. The creatures that had ruled terrestrial ecosystems since the Triassic period had been slowly, inexorably eliminated, not by the violence of a single catastrophic moment, but by their inability to adapt to a world where the basic environmental parameters of life had been permanently altered. The mammals, birds, and other survivors that inherited this new Earth would spend the next several million years diversifying into the ecological niches left vacant by the extinct dinosaurs, but they would do so in a world that operated under different rules than the stable, abundant Mesozoic Earth where dinosaurs had thrived. The climate systems, vegetation patterns, and ocean chemistry of the Cenozoic era would be shaped by the long-term consequences of that brief moment 66 million years ago when a mountain-sized asteroid struck the Yucatan Peninsula and began the slow transformation of our planet. The story of the dinosaurs' extinction is ultimately a story about the fundamental interconnectedness of Earth's environmental systems and the vulnerability of even the most successful organisms to changes that exceed their adaptive capacity. The asteroid impact itself was a brief, violent event that lasted only minutes, but the climate changes it triggered unfolded over hundreds of thousands of years, creating an environmental cascade that slowly dismantled the ecological foundations upon which dinosaur civilization had been built. The survivors that remained were the quiet inheritors of a broken world, creatures whose modest requirements and flexible strategies had prepared them, almost by accident, for the environmental chaos that followed the impact. While the great dinosaur dynasties slowly faded into memory, these humble organisms began the patient work of rebuilding Earth's ecosystems from the ground up. The mammals that emerged from their burrows and hiding places were unremarkable by Mesozoic standards. Most were no larger than modern rats, with simple teeth designed for crushing insects and cracking seeds. Their fur-covered bodies had evolved to maintain constant internal temperatures, a metabolic luxury that had seemed wasteful during the energy-abundant Cretaceous period, but now proved invaluable in the temperature swings of the post-impact world. These small creatures could remain active during the cold nights of the impact winter, foraging for food while the cold-blooded reptiles lay motionless. Their metabolism slowed to near hibernation levels. The evolutionary advantages of small size became apparent as the New World took shape. A shrew-like creature weighing 20 grams could survive for weeks on the amount of food that a single triceratops would have consumed in an hour. When plant seeds became one of the few reliable food sources during the recovery period, these tiny mammals could thrive on resources that would have been invisible to the great herbivorous dinosaurs. Their high reproductive rates meant that populations could recover quickly from local disasters, and their ability to dig burrows provided protection from both temperature extremes and the occasional predator. Among the most successful of these mammalian survivors were the early primates, insectivores, and ungulates, whose descendants would eventually diversify into the vast array of mammalian life that characterizes our modern world. But in the immediate aftermath of the extinction, they were simply small, brown, cautious creatures moving through a landscape of opportunities that their ancestors could never have imagined. The ecological niches that had been filled by dozens of dinosaur species were now vacant, waiting to be colonized by organisms adaptable enough to exploit them. The birds that survived the extinction represented the continuation of the dinosaur lineage itself, though in forms so reduced and specialized that they bore little resemblance to their magnificent ancestors. The survivors were predominantly ground-dwelling species that could find food among the leaf litter and soil debris that accumulated during the ecosystem collapse. Their ability to fly provided crucial advantages during the unstable climate period, allowing them to travel vast distances in search of favorable conditions and to escape local environmental catastrophes that might have trapped ground-bound animals. Many of the surviving bird species were seed eaters, a dietary specialization that proved remarkably prescient as flowering plants began to dominate the recovering ecosystems. Unlike the large herbivorous dinosaurs that had depended on abundant green vegetation, these small birds could survive on the concentrated energy stored in seeds and nuts. Their rapid metabolisms, while demanding in terms of food requirements, also allowed them to process these high-energy foods efficiently and to remain active in the variable temperatures of the post-impact climate. The reptilian survivors of the extinction event were those species that had already adapted to lifestyles that would prove advantageous in the chaotic post-impact environment. Crocodilians survived because their semi-aquatic habits provided access to food sources that remained available even when terrestrial ecosystems collapsed. Freshwater environments were among the most stable during the climate crisis, and the detritus-based food webs of rivers and lakes continued to function even when photosynthesis had virtually ceased on land. Turtles endured the environmental catastrophe through a combination of protective adaptations that had evolved for entirely different purposes. Their shells provided physical protection during the period of environmental chaos, while their ability to slow their metabolisms allowed them to survive on minimal food resources. Many turtle species were omnivorous, capable of eating both plant and animal matter as availability changed, and their long lifespans meant that individuals could potentially survive the entire duration of the environmental crisis and reproduce when conditions improved. Snakes and lizards that survived were generally small species with low metabolic requirements and flexible diets. Their cold-blooded physiology, while disadvantageous during the coldest periods of the impact winter, actually became beneficial during the recovery phase when environmental temperatures were highly variable. Unlike warm-blooded animals that had to maintain constant body temperatures regardless of external conditions, these reptiles could adjust their energy expenditure based on available resources. The insect communities that emerged from the extinction were among the most important groups in rebuilding terrestrial ecosystems. Many insect species had survived the impact winter in various dormant stages, as eggs, pupae, or hibernating adults hidden in soil or plant debris. Their rapid reproductive cycles allowed populations to explode as soon as environmental conditions permitted, and their diverse feeding strategies meant they could take advantage of almost any available organic matter. Decomposer insects became particularly important during the early recovery period, processing the vast quantities of dead plant and animal material that accumulated during the ecosystem collapse. These insects converted the organic debris into nutrients that could be used by the slowly recovering plant communities, essentially recycling the biomass of the extinct Cretaceous ecosystems into the building blocks for new Cenozoic life. Their activities helped accelerate the recovery of soil chemistry and nutrient cycles that had been disrupted by the environmental catastrophe. Plant communities that began to recolonize the devastated landscapes were fundamentally different from those that had supported dinosaur ecosystems. Ferns, with their ability to reproduce through wind-dispersed spores and their tolerance for poor soil conditions, were among the first to return to areas that had been stripped of vegetation. The fossil record shows a dramatic spike in fern spores immediately following the extinction event, suggesting that these ancient plants played a crucial role in stabilizing soil and beginning the process of ecological recovery. Flowering plants, which had been diversifying throughout the Cretaceous period, proved to be the ultimate winners in the post-extinction plant communities. Their rapid growth rates, efficient reproductive strategies, and diverse relationships with animal pollinators allowed them to colonize disturbed habitats much more quickly than the slower-growing conifers that had dominated Mesozoic forests. The coevolution between flowering plants and their animal pollinators, particularly insects, helped drive the recovery and diversification of both plant and animal communities. The forests that eventually emerged were characterized by deciduous trees that could shed their leaves during unfavorable seasons, a strategy that proved highly adaptive in the climatically unstable post-impact world. These trees could adjust their energy expenditure based on environmental conditions, growing rapidly during favorable periods and conserving resources during times of stress. Their leaf litter created rich soil environments that supported diverse communities of decomposer organisms and small animals. Marine ecosystems underwent their own dramatic reorganization during the recovery period. The collapse of the large marine reptiles left vacant ecological niches that would eventually be filled by entirely different groups of organisms. In the immediate aftermath of the extinction, marine food webs were rebuilt around smaller, more rapidly reproducing species that could take advantage of the patchy distribution of nutrients in the recovering oceans. Bony fish, which had suffered heavy losses during the extinction event, began to diversify rapidly as ocean conditions stabilized. Their relatively high reproductive rates and diverse feeding strategies allowed them to exploit new ecological opportunities as they became available. Many of the fish families that would dominate Cenozoic marine ecosystems first appeared during this period of post-extinction diversification. Marine invertebrates that survived the extinction were primarily those with the most flexible life cycles and feeding strategies. Many surviving mollusk groups were deposit feeders that could survive on organic matter that settled to the seafloor, rather than depending on the photosynthetic organisms that had been eliminated during the impact winter. These detritus-based food webs provided the foundation for marine ecosystem recovery. The recovery of marine primary productivity occurred gradually as phytoplankton communities slowly re-established themselves. The species that recolonized the oceans were often different from those that had dominated Cretaceous seas, reflecting the changed chemical and physical conditions of post-impact marine environments. These new phytoplankton communities would support fundamentally different marine food webs than those that had existed during the age of dinosaurs. Freshwater environments served as crucial refugia during the extinction event and played important roles in the subsequent recovery. Rivers and lakes maintained more stable conditions than either terrestrial or marine environments, and many groups of organisms that survived the extinction did so by retreating to these freshwater habitats. The amphibians, fish, and aquatic invertebrates that inhabited these environments provided stepping stones for the recolonization of more severely affected ecosystems. The soil communities that developed during the recovery period were essential to the re-establishment of terrestrial life. Bacteria, fungi, and other microorganisms that had survived the environmental catastrophe in dormant states began the slow process of rebuilding the complex chemical cycles that support plant growth. These invisible organisms processed organic matter, fixed nitrogen, and created the chemical conditions necessary for plant roots to extract nutrients from the soil. Mycorrhizal fungi, which form symbiotic relationships with plant roots, proved particularly important in helping plants colonize the nutrient-poor soils that characterized many post-impact landscapes. These fungi extended the effective root systems of plants, allowing them to access water and nutrients from much larger soil volumes than their actual roots could reach. The partnerships between fungi and plants helped accelerate the recovery of plant communities and the stabilization of soil systems. As the various survivor groups began to interact with one another, new ecological relationships emerged that would define Cenozoic ecosystems. The coevolution between flowering plants and their animal pollinators intensified, leading to the incredible diversity of flowers, fruits, and pollinating insects that characterizes modern terrestrial ecosystems. The relationships between predators and prey were reorganized around the smaller, more agile organisms that had inherited the post-extinction world. The mammalian radiation that began during this recovery period would eventually produce the diverse array of large herbivores and carnivores that would fill many of the ecological roles previously occupied by dinosaurs. But this diversification took millions of years to unfold, and the early post-extinction ecosystems were characterized by much smaller organisms with more generalized lifestyles than the highly specialized dinosaur communities they replaced. The establishment of new food webs proceeded through predictable stages, with primary producers recovering first, followed by herbivores, and finally carnivores. But the specific organisms that filled these roles were often completely different from those that had dominated Cretaceous ecosystems. The ecological functions remained the same, but the organisms performing those functions were the descendants of the modest survivors rather than the magnificent dinosaurs that had been eliminated. Geographic patterns of recovery varied significantly depending on local environmental conditions and the proximity to refugial areas where survivor populations had persisted. Some regions recovered relatively quickly as survivor species spread out from protected habitats, while others remained essentially lifeless for extended periods before being recolonized by organisms dispersing from distant areas. The climate stabilization that eventually ended the post-impact environmental crisis took hundreds of thousands of years to complete. During this extended period, the survivor organisms had time to adapt to the new environmental conditions and begin the evolutionary diversification that would characterize the Cenozoic era. The world that emerged from this long recovery period was fundamentally different from the Mesozoic world that had been destroyed. But it was also remarkably rich and diverse in its own way. The evolutionary innovations that appeared during the recovery period reflected adaptations to the environmental instability and resource scarcity that had characterized the post-impact world. Many surviving lineages evolved more efficient metabolisms, more flexible diets, and more rapid reproductive strategies than their Mesozoic ancestors. These adaptations would prove valuable not only during the immediate recovery period, but also during the subsequent evolutionary radiation of Cenozoic life. The extinction of the non-avian dinosaurs created evolutionary opportunities that would not have existed in the stable Mesozoic world. The vacant ecological niches left by the extinct dinosaurs provided space for the diversification of mammalian, bird, and other survivor lineages into forms and lifestyles that would have been impossible in a world still dominated by large dinosaurs. The environmental catastrophe that ended the Mesozoic era also created the conditions necessary for the evolutionary innovations that would define the Cenozoic era. In the end, the slow death of the dinosaurs was also the slow birth of the modern world. The climate catastrophe that followed the asteroid impact eliminated the dominant organisms of the Mesozoic era, but also created the environmental conditions and evolutionary opportunities that allowed new forms of life to emerge and flourish. The modest survivors that inherited the post-impact Earth would eventually give rise to the incredible diversity of life that surrounds us today. From the smallest mammals to the largest whales, all descended from creatures that were small enough, flexible enough, and fortunate enough to survive the slow collapse of the dinosaur world. The great climate reversal that followed the asteroid impact demonstrates the profound interconnectedness of Earth's environmental systems and the vulnerability of even the most successful organisms to changes that exceed their adaptive capacity. The dinosaurs had ruled Earth for over 160 million years, surviving ice ages, volcanic catastrophes, and continental drift. But they could not survive the fundamental alteration of Earth's climate systems that followed a single moment of cosmic violence on a morning 66 million years ago. Today, as we face our own period of rapid climate change, the story of the dinosaurs' extinction serves as a reminder of how quickly stable environmental conditions can be disrupted and how difficult it can be for complex ecosystems to recover from such disruptions. The creatures that survived the end Cretaceous extinction were those that could adapt to changing conditions, survive on limited resources, and exploit new opportunities as they arose. Their descendants inherited a world that had been transformed by climate change, and they spent millions of years rebuilding the rich ecosystems that characterize our modern Earth. The asteroid impact that ended the age of dinosaurs was a brief moment of violence in a story that unfolded over geological timescales. But the climate changes it triggered created a cascade of environmental effects that slowly, inexorably transformed our planet from a world of giants into a world of survivors. In the quiet aftermath of that cosmic catastrophe, as the dust finally settled and sunlight returned to Earth's surface, the patient work of evolution began again, building new forms of life from the ashes of the old, creating the rich and diverse biosphere that would eventually give rise to our own species and the world we call home. The world that emerged from this long period of climate chaos was profoundly different from anything that had existed before. As the extreme temperature swings gradually moderated and atmospheric conditions began to stabilize, roughly 300,000 years after the impact, Earth settled into new patterns of weather and climate that would define the early Paleocene epoch. The violent oscillations between freezing darkness and scorching heat slowly gave way to more predictable seasonal cycles, but these new rhythms bore little resemblance to the gentle, stable climate that had nurtured dinosaur civilizations for so long. Ocean currents, which had been disrupted by the massive temperature changes, began to establish new circulation patterns around the altered geography of the post-impact world. The warm, shallow seas that had covered much of North America during the Cretaceous had retreated, exposing vast continental areas to more extreme seasonal temperature variations. The global ocean conveyor belt that drives modern climate patterns was fundamentally reorganized, creating new zones of upwelling and deep water formation that would influence weather patterns for millions of years to come. Atmospheric circulation also settled into new configurations as the excess carbon dioxide gradually began to cycle out of the atmosphere through natural processes. But this removal of greenhouse gases was painfully slow, measured in hundreds of thousands of years, rather than the decades or centuries that had characterized the initial climate disruption. The weathering of rocks exposed by the environmental catastrophe slowly consumed atmospheric CO2, while the recovering plant communities began to sequester carbon in their biomass and in the soil organic matter that accumulated beneath the new forests. The ice caps that had formed during the impact winter gradually melted as global temperatures stabilized at levels several degrees warmer than the pre-impact climate. But the distribution of this warmth was uneven, creating new climate zones and weather patterns that would challenge any organisms attempting to re-establish continental-scale populations. The polar regions, which had been ice-free during much of the Cretaceous, now experienced seasonal freezing that created barriers to migration and dispersal that had not existed in the dinosaur world. In this slowly stabilizing climate, the plant communities that had begun to colonize the devastated landscapes continued their quiet transformation of terrestrial ecosystems. The ferns that had been among the first colonizers were gradually joined by flowering plants, and eventually by new types of forests, dominated by deciduous trees that could shed their leaves during unfavorable seasons. These new plant communities were more resilient to climate variability than the conifer-dominated forests of the Cretaceous, but they also provided different types of food and habitat than the vegetation that had supported dinosaur ecosystems. The chemical composition of soils changed as well, influenced by the altered precipitation patterns and the different types of organic matter being produced by the new plant communities. The deep, rich soils that had developed under stable Cretaceous forests were replaced by thinner, more variable soil profiles that reflected the environmental instability of the recovery period. These new soils supported different types of plant growth and created different patterns of nutrient cycling that would influence terrestrial ecosystems for millions of years. Marine environments underwent equally dramatic reorganization as ocean chemistry gradually returned toward pre-impact conditions. The acidification that had devastated shell-building organisms slowly reversed as excess atmospheric CO2 was absorbed and neutralized by chemical weathering on land. But the marine ecosystems that recovered were built around entirely different groups of organisms than those that had dominated Cretaceous seas. The massive marine reptiles were gone forever, their ecological roles eventually filled by entirely different types of predators that would not appear for millions of years. The microscopic plankton communities that form the base of marine food webs were also fundamentally different from their Cretaceous predecessors. The species that recolonized the oceans were those that had survived the environmental catastrophe in deep water refugia or in dormant stages, and they created marine ecosystems with different patterns of productivity and nutrient cycling than those that had existed before the impact. These new marine communities were more resilient to environmental change, but also less productive in terms of total biomass than the rich Cretaceous seas that had supported enormous marine reptiles. Freshwater environments, which had served as crucial refugia during the worst of the environmental crisis, became launching points for the recolonization of terrestrial and marine habitats. Rivers and lakes that had maintained relatively stable conditions during the climate chaos now harbored the survivor populations that would spread out to repopulate the recovering world. The fish, amphibians, and aquatic invertebrates that had endured the extinction in these freshwater refugia became the ancestors of many Cenozoic lineages, but perhaps the most significant change was in the fundamental energy dynamics of Earth's ecosystems. The Cretaceous world had been characterized by enormous organisms with massive energy requirements, supported by highly productive plant communities in stable climates. The post-impact world was rebuilt around smaller organisms, with more modest energy demands, reflecting the reduced primary productivity and environmental unpredictability that characterized the recovery period. This shift towards smaller body sizes was evident across all major groups of surviving organisms. The mammals that began to diversify in the early Paleocene were tiny compared to the dinosaurs they were replacing. The largest mammal species of the early Paleocene weighed no more than a few kilograms, a fraction of the size of even medium-sized dinosaurs. This miniaturization reflected both the limited food resources available during the recovery period and the advantages of small size in an unstable environment. Bird communities also remained dominated by small species throughout the early recovery period. While some bird lineages would eventually evolve larger body sizes, the immediate post-extinction avian fauna consisted primarily of species weighing less than a kilogram. These small birds could survive on the limited seed and insect resources available in the recovering ecosystems, and their high reproductive rates allowed populations to recover quickly from local environmental disasters. Even among the surviving reptilian groups, there was a general trend towards smaller body sizes and more conservative life history strategies. The crocodilians that survived the extinction were generally smaller than their Cretaceous relatives, and they remained primarily freshwater species, rather than expanding into the diverse marine and terrestrial niches that crocodilian groups had occupied during the Mesozoic. Turtles also tended to be smaller and more generalized in their ecological requirements than many of their extinct relatives. This miniaturization of life was accompanied by changes in ecosystem structure that would persist for millions of years. Instead of the towering forests dominated by massive dinosaurs that had characterized Cretaceous landscapes, the early Paleocene world was characterized by lower, more open vegetation communities supporting smaller animals with more generalized lifestyles. Food webs were simpler and less specialized than those of the Mesozoic, reflecting both the reduced diversity of surviving species and the environmental instability that made specialization risky. The absence of large herbivorous dinosaurs had profound effects on plant community structure and evolution. Without the constant browsing pressure from enormous sauropods and hadrosaurs, plants no longer needed to invest heavily in defensive structures and chemicals. Trees could grow with thinner bark and softer wood. Shrubs could develop more nutritious leaves without fear of being completely defoliated by massive herbivores. This release from herbivore pressure allowed flowering plants to explore new evolutionary strategies and contributed to their rapid diversification during the early Cenozoic. Similarly, the extinction of large carnivorous dinosaurs removed the selective pressure for defensive adaptations in many animal groups. Small mammals no longer needed to evolve elaborate anti-predator strategies to avoid being eaten by tyrannosaurs. Instead, they could invest their evolutionary energy in exploiting new food sources and habitats that became available as ecosystems reorganized. This freedom from predation pressure contributed to the rapid adaptive radiation of mammalian groups during the Paleocene. The pollination networks that had evolved between flowering plants and their animal partners were completely reorganized during the recovery period. Many of the specialized pollination relationships that had developed during the Cretaceous were broken when either the plant or animal partner went extinct. The pollination systems that emerged during the recovery were generally more generalized, with plants being pollinated by multiple insect species and insects visiting multiple plant species. This generalization made the new pollination networks more resilient to future environmental disruptions, but also less efficient than the highly specialized systems they replaced. Seed dispersal mechanisms also changed as the large herbivorous dinosaurs that had transported seeds across vast distances disappeared from ecosystems. Plants evolved new strategies for dispersing their seeds, including smaller seeds that could be carried by wind, seeds with hooks or barbs that could attach to the fur of small mammals, and fleshy fruits that attracted bird dispersers. These new dispersal mechanisms were less effective at moving seeds across continental distances, but were more reliable in the patchy, unstable environments that characterized the early Cenozoic. The seasonal patterns that governed ecosystem function were also fundamentally altered by the climate changes that followed the asteroid impact. The stable, predictable seasons of the Cretaceous were replaced by more variable seasonal cycles with greater temperature ranges and less predictable precipitation patterns. This increased seasonality favored organisms with flexible life cycles and the ability to enter dormant states during unfavorable periods. Many plant species evolved deciduous habits, shedding their leaves during cold or dry seasons to conserve energy and water. Animal migration patterns were completely reorganized as well. The continent-spanning migrations of large dinosaur herds were no longer possible in a world of smaller organisms and more fragmented habitats. Instead, animal movements became more localized, with species moving shorter distances between seasonal habitats or simply adjusting their activity patterns to cope with seasonal changes. The great flyways that modern birds use for migration would not be established for millions of years, as surviving bird populations slowly rebuilt their numbers and expanded their ranges. Nutrient cycling in terrestrial ecosystems was profoundly affected by the changes in dominant organism types and ecosystem structure. The massive amounts of organic matter that had been cycled through dinosaur digestive systems was no longer being processed and redistributed across landscapes. Instead, nutrient cycling became dominated by smaller-scale processes involving decomposer organisms and the root systems of plants. This change in nutrient dynamics influenced soil development and plant growth patterns throughout the early Cenozoic. The carbon cycle, which had been severely disrupted by the asteroid impact and its aftermath, slowly began to stabilize as plant communities recovered and atmospheric CO2 levels gradually declined. But this new carbon cycle operated under different parameters than the pre-impact system. The reduced biomass of terrestrial ecosystems meant that less carbon was stored in living organisms, while the increased weathering rates caused by climate instability accelerated the removal of carbon from the atmosphere through rock weathering processes. Atmospheric oxygen levels, which had been elevated during much of the Cretaceous, began to decline as the reduced plant biomass and altered patterns of organic matter burial changed the global oxygen budget. This decline in atmospheric oxygen may have contributed to the miniaturization of animal life during the early Cenozoic, as lower oxygen levels favored smaller body sizes with lower metabolic oxygen demands. The atmospheric composition that emerged from the post-impact period would remain relatively stable for millions of years, providing the chemical foundation for Cenozoic life. Ocean productivity patterns were also permanently altered by the extinction and subsequent recovery. The highly productive Cretaceous seas, which had supported enormous populations of marine reptiles and diverse communities of marine invertebrates, were replaced by less productive but more stable marine ecosystems. The new patterns of ocean circulation and nutrient distribution created different zones of productivity that favored different types of marine organisms than those that had dominated Mesozoic seas. The deep ocean environments that had served as refugia for some organisms during the environmental crisis gradually reconnected with surface waters as ocean circulation patterns stabilized. These deep-sea communities became sources of colonists for the recovering surface ecosystems, contributing genetic diversity and ecological innovations that helped drive the recovery process. The organisms that emerged from these deep-sea refugia often showed adaptations to low oxygen, low temperature conditions that proved advantageous in the variable environmental conditions of the early Cenozoic. As the climate finally stabilized and ecosystems began to mature, roughly 500,000 years after the impact, the stage was set for the great evolutionary radiations that would characterize the Cenozoic era. But these radiations would unfold in a world that operated under fundamentally different rules than the stable, abundant Mesozoic Earth where dinosaurs had thrived. The survivors that inherited this new world had been shaped by their experience of environmental catastrophe and climate chaos, and their descendants would carry the evolutionary innovations developed during the crisis into the future. The mammalian lineages that would eventually diversify into the incredible array of Cenozoic mammals all trace their ancestry back to the small generalized species that had survived the extinction. These early mammals had evolved flexible metabolisms, efficient reproductive strategies, and adaptable behaviors that would serve their descendants well as they radiated into the vacant ecological niches left by extinct dinosaurs. But this radiation would take millions of years to unfold, and the early Cenozoic world remained dominated by small, conservative organisms for extended periods. Bird evolution also proceeded along new trajectories in the post-extinction world. The surviving bird lineages, freed from competition with pterosaurs and large carnivorous dinosaurs, began to explore new ecological niches and evolve new body plans and behaviors. But like the mammals, bird diversification was initially constrained by the limited productivity and environmental instability of early Cenozoic ecosystems. The spectacular diversity of modern bird life would not appear for millions of years. Even the plant communities that formed the foundation of recovering terrestrial ecosystems continued to evolve in response to the altered environmental conditions and changed animal communities of the post-impact world. The flowering plants that came to dominate Cenozoic floras developed new reproductive strategies, defense mechanisms, and ecological relationships that reflected their experience of environmental catastrophe and recovery. These evolutionary innovations would make them more resilient to future environmental changes, but also fundamentally different from their Cretaceous ancestors. The insects that had played crucial roles in ecosystem recovery continued to diversify and evolve new ecological relationships with the recovering plant and animal communities. Many modern insect families first appeared during the early Cenozoic, filling ecological niches that had been created by the extinction of other groups or the evolution of new types of ecological relationships. The coevolution between insects and flowering plants that had begun during the Cretaceous accelerated during the recovery period, driving innovations in both groups. Marine ecosystems also continued to evolve and reorganize as environmental conditions stabilized. The fish communities that came to dominate Cenozoic seas were built around lineages that had survived the extinction in freshwater or deep-sea refugia. These survivor lineages evolved new body plans and ecological strategies as they colonized the vacant marine niches left by extinct groups. The marine ecosystems that emerged were more resilient to environmental change, but also less diverse in terms of large predators than their Mesozoic predecessors. The recovery of reef ecosystems was particularly slow and involved the evolution of entirely new types of reef-building organisms. The rudest bivalves that had built many Cretaceous reefs were extinct, and it would be millions of years before coral reefs would again become major marine ecosystems. The reef communities that eventually developed were built around different types of organisms, using different ecological strategies than their Mesozoic predecessors. As the various survivor lineages began to interact and co-evolve in the stabilizing post-impact world, new types of ecological relationships emerged that would define Cenozoic ecosystems. Predator-prey relationships were reorganized around smaller, more agile organisms. Competitive interactions developed between expanding mammalian and bird lineages as they competed for similar ecological resources. Mutualistic relationships evolved between plants and their animal partners as pollination and seed dispersal networks were rebuilt. The geographic patterns of biodiversity that emerged during the recovery period were also different from those that had characterized the Mesozoic world. The environmental instability and fragmented habitats of the early Cenozoic created isolated populations that evolved independently, increasing regional diversity, but reducing the cosmopolitan distributions that had characterized many Mesozoic species. This increased regionalization of biodiversity would become a defining feature of Cenozoic biogeography. Climate patterns continued to evolve throughout the early Cenozoic, but the extreme instability that had characterized the immediate post-impact period gradually gave way to more predictable variations. The development of seasonal ice caps at the poles created new climate dynamics that had not existed during the greenhouse conditions of the Cretaceous. These new climate patterns favored organisms with seasonal adaptations and created migration corridors that would shape biogeographic patterns for millions of years. The soil ecosystems that developed during the recovery period also continued to evolve as plant and animal communities matured. The complex networks of mycorrhizal fungi, decomposer organisms, and soil invertebrates that support modern terrestrial ecosystems were gradually assembled from survivor lineages and evolutionary innovations that appeared during the recovery process. These soil communities would provide the foundation for the productive terrestrial ecosystems that would support the eventual radiation of large mammals. Freshwater ecosystems, which had served as crucial refugia during the extinction, became centers of evolutionary innovation as survivor lineages adapted to the changing environmental conditions. Many modern freshwater fish families evolved during the early Cenozoic, filling ecological niches that had been vacated by extinct groups or created by changing environmental conditions. These freshwater innovations often served as stepping stones for the colonization of marine environments as ocean conditions stabilized. The atmospheric chemistry that stabilized during the early Cenozoic created new opportunities and constraints for life. The reduced oxygen levels favored different types of metabolisms than those that had dominated during the high oxygen Cretaceous. The altered carbon dioxide concentrations affected plant physiology and growth patterns. These atmospheric changes influenced the evolution of respiratory systems, metabolic strategies, and body size distributions across all major groups of organisms. By the time the early Cenozoic world had fully stabilized, roughly 1 million years after the asteroid impact, Earth hosted ecosystems that were fundamentally different from anything that had existed during the Mesozoic era. The survivors had not simply rebuilt the old world, they had constructed something entirely new from the fragments of the past. This new world was smaller in scale, more variable in its environmental conditions, and more resilient to change than the stable, abundant dinosaur world it had replaced. The great evolutionary radiations that would eventually fill the ecological void left by the extinct dinosaurs were just beginning as environmental conditions finally stabilized. Over the following millions of years, the modest survivors would give rise to the spectacular diversity of Cenozoic life, from tiny shrews to enormous whales, from delicate flowers to towering redwoods. But all of this future diversity traced its ancestry back to the humble organisms that had endured the slow death of the dinosaur world and emerged to inherit a planet transformed by climate catastrophe. The story of recovery was also a story of opportunity. The environmental disaster that had eliminated the dinosaurs also created evolutionary possibilities that had not existed in the stable Mesozoic world. The vacant ecological niches, altered environmental conditions, and reduced competition allowed survivor lineages to explore new evolutionary pathways and develop innovations that would define life on Earth for the next 66 million years. In this sense, the slow death of the dinosaurs was also the slow birth of the modern world, a transformation driven not by a single moment of destruction, but by the patient process of adaptation and recovery that followed the greatest climate catastrophe in Earth's history. The climate changes that killed the dinosaurs ultimately created the conditions for our own existence. The mammals that inherited the post-impact world would eventually give rise to primates, and those primates would eventually evolve into humans. The flowering plants that diversified during the recovery would become the crops that feed our civilization. The ecosystems that emerged from the ashes of the Mesozoic would provide the natural heritage that we strive to protect today. In the end, we are all children of the survivors, descendants of the creatures that were small enough, adaptable enough, and fortunate enough to endure the slow transformation of a world. The final chapter of this extraordinary transformation unfolded not with dramatic flourishes, but with the quiet persistence of life itself. 10 million years after the asteroid impact, Earth had settled into rhythms that would have seemed alien to any time-traveling dinosaur from the Cretaceous period. The planet's surface bore little resemblance to the world that had existed before that fateful morning over the Yucatan Peninsula, yet it pulsed with a different kind of vitality entirely. The descendants of the survivors had begun to fill the ecological spaces left vacant by their massive predecessors, but they did so in ways that reflected the harsh lessons learned during those catastrophic centuries of climate chaos. Evolution, that patient sculptor of life, had been working steadily to craft new forms suited to a world where environmental stability could never again be taken for granted. The creatures that emerged from this evolutionary laboratory were fundamentally different from their Mesozoic ancestors, shaped by generations of ancestors who had endured the unthinkable. In the forests that now covered much of the recovering continents, something remarkable was taking place. The trees themselves were different, their leaves broader and more efficient at capturing the filtered sunlight that penetrated the canopy. These were the descendants of the flowering plants that had survived the Great Dying, and they had learned to make the most of every photon of solar energy. Beneath their branches, creatures moved that would have puzzled any observer from the age of dinosaurs. Small mammals, no larger than house cats, scurried through the understory with an alertness that spoke to generations of survival in uncertain times. Their fur was thick and varied in color, adaptations to temperature fluctuations that their Mesozoic ancestors had never needed to consider. Their eyes were large and expressive, capable of gathering light efficiently during the dim periods that still occasionally darkened the sky when volcanic activity or severe storms disrupted atmospheric conditions. These mammals moved with quick, darting motions, pausing frequently to scan for danger or opportunity, with senses honed by millions of years of environmental unpredictability. Above them, in the canopy, birds sang songs that carried melodies no dinosaur had ever heard. These avian survivors had diversified into forms that filled many of the ecological roles once occupied by their larger relatives, but they had done so with bodies designed for efficiency rather than dominance. Some had evolved to be accomplished seed dispersers, their digestive systems perfectly calibrated to process the nutrient-rich fruits that had become abundant in the post-impact world. Others had become expert insect hunters, their beaks and talons adapted to capture the diverse arthropod communities that had flourished in the warming climate. The insect life that supported these bird communities was itself a testament to the power of small-scale survival strategies. In the soil beneath the forest floor, countless species of beetles, ants, and other invertebrates went about the essential work of decomposition and nutrient cycling. Many of these insects were the direct descendants of creatures that had spent the impact winter in dormant stages, emerging years later to find a world transformed. Their life cycles had been refined by natural selection to include multiple backup strategies for surviving environmental disruption, from extended dormancy periods to rapid reproductive cycles that could take advantage of brief favorable conditions. The streams and rivers that wound through these recovering landscapes carried life forms that told their own stories of survival and adaptation. Fish communities had been rebuilt from the few species that had endured the climate catastrophe in deep pools or underground water systems. These survivor fish had given rise to new varieties adapted to the altered chemistry and temperature patterns of post-impact waterways. Many had evolved more efficient gills and enhanced sensory systems that allowed them to detect subtle changes in water quality that might signal environmental stress. Along the banks of these waterways, amphibians that bore little resemblance to their Cretaceous predecessors called to mates with voices that had been fine-tuned over millions of years of evolution. Their skin chemistry had adapted to tolerate the occasional acid rains that still fell when atmospheric disturbances mobilized residual sulfur compounds from the impact period. Their reproductive strategies had become remarkably flexible, allowing them to breed successfully even when environmental conditions were less than ideal. The reptilian survivors had taken their own unique evolutionary paths through the post-impact world. Crocodilians had emerged from their freshwater refugia to diversify into forms both familiar and strange. Some remained tied to aquatic environments, but others had ventured onto land, developing new hunting strategies and social behaviors. Their cold-blooded physiology, once a disadvantage during the impact winter, had proven remarkably adaptable to the variable temperatures of the recovering world. They could slow their metabolisms during difficult periods and accelerate their activity when conditions improved, a flexibility that warm-blooded animals could not match. Turtles had also survived and diversified, their protective shells having served them well during the chaotic climate period. Some had evolved larger sizes as environmental conditions stabilized, while others had specialized for life in specific habitats that had emerged during the recovery. Their long lifespans meant that individual turtles alive, 10 million years after the impact, might have had grandparents who had witnessed the early stages of ecosystem recovery, creating a living link to the immediate post-extinction period. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this transformed world was not any individual species, but the web of relationships that connected them all. The ecosystems that had emerged from the ashes of the Mesozoic operated according to principles that prioritized resilience over efficiency, diversity over dominance, and flexibility over specialization. Food webs were more complex than they had been in the immediate aftermath of the extinction, but they remained less rigidly hierarchical than their Cretaceous predecessors. Pollination networks had been rebuilt around partnerships between plants and insects that emphasized redundancy and flexibility. Most flowering plants could be pollinated by multiple insect species, and most pollinators could visit multiple plant species, creating a web of relationships that could withstand the loss of individual partners. This redundancy came at a cost in terms of efficiency, but it provided insurance against future environmental disruptions that the survivors' ancestors had learned to expect. Seed dispersal mechanisms had similarly evolved to include multiple pathways for moving plant genes across the landscape. Wind dispersal, water dispersal, and animal dispersal all played important roles, ensuring that plant populations could respond rapidly to environmental changes by colonizing new habitats or escaping from deteriorating conditions. The plants that thrived in this new world were those that had learned to hedge their bets across multiple reproductive strategies. Predator-prey relationships had also been restructured around principles of sustainability rather than maximum exploitation. The carnivores that emerged from the post-impact period were generally smaller and more opportunistic than their Mesozoic predecessors, capable of switching between different prey species as availability changed. This flexibility prevented the boom and bust cycles that had characterized some Cretaceous ecosystems, where specialized predators could drive their prey to local extinction and then face starvation themselves. Herbivore communities had developed their own strategies for sustainable resource use. Instead of the massive herds of specialized feeders that had characterized dinosaur ecosystems, post-impact herbivores tended to be smaller, more dispersed, and more generalized in their dietary preferences. They could extract nutrition from a wider variety of plant materials, reducing their dependence on any single food source and allowing plant communities to recover more quickly from grazing pressure. The seasonal patterns that governed life in this new world were more pronounced than those of the Cretaceous, reflecting the altered climate dynamics that had emerged from the post-impact period. Many organisms had evolved strong seasonal behaviors, entering dormant or reduced activity states during unfavorable periods and concentrating their reproductive efforts during optimal times. This seasonality created temporal niches that allowed multiple species to coexist in the same habitats by using resources at different times of year. Migration patterns had also been re-established, but they operated on smaller spatial scales than the continent-spanning movements of Cretaceous dinosaurs. Birds, mammals, and even some reptiles had evolved seasonal movement patterns that allowed them to track resources across regional landscapes without undertaking the massive migrations that had been possible in the more stable Mesozoic world. These smaller-scale movements provided many of the benefits of migration while reducing the risks associated with long-distance travel through variable environments. The soil communities that supported all terrestrial life had become extraordinarily complex, reflecting the importance of below-ground processes in maintaining ecosystem stability. Mycorrhizal fungi had formed partnerships with plant roots that were more extensive and sophisticated than anything that had existed before the impact. These fungal networks not only helped plants access nutrients and water, but also served as communication systems that allowed plant communities to coordinate their responses to environmental changes. Bacterial and other microbial communities in the soil had also diversified extensively, creating multiple pathways for nutrient cycling and organic matter decomposition. This microbial diversity provided insurance against the failure of any single decomposition pathway and ensured that nutrients would continue to cycle even during environmental stress periods. The invisible world of soil organisms had become the foundation upon which all other life depended, a lesson learned during the dark years when decomposer communities had been among the few functional elements in collapsed ecosystems. Ocean ecosystems had undergone their own remarkable transformation during the 10 million years since the impact. The marine communities that had emerged were built around smaller, more rapidly reproducing organisms than those that had dominated Mesozoic seas, but they had achieved a productivity and stability that would have seemed impossible during the chaos of the immediate post-impact period. Phytoplankton communities had not only recovered, but had diversified into forms that were more resilient to environmental disruption than their predecessors. These microscopic marine plants had evolved multiple strategies for surviving temporary reductions in sunlight or changes in water chemistry. Some could enter dormant stages during unfavorable conditions, while others had developed the ability to use alternative energy sources when photosynthesis was not possible. The diversity of phytoplankton species meant that marine primary productivity could continue even when individual species were stressed by environmental changes. The fish communities that fed on these phytoplankton had also become more diverse and resilient. Instead of being dominated by a few highly specialized species, marine ecosystems now supported multiple species that occupied similar ecological roles, providing redundancy that protected against ecosystem collapse. These fish had evolved more flexible feeding strategies and more efficient reproductive systems that allowed populations to recover quickly from environmental disturbances. Marine food webs had been restructured around principles that emphasized energy efficiency and stability over maximum biomass production. The enormous marine reptiles of the Cretaceous had been replaced by smaller predators that required less energy to maintain and were less vulnerable to fluctuations in prey availability. These new marine ecosystems were less spectacular than their Mesozoic predecessors, but they were also more sustainable and more capable of withstanding environmental stress. Coral reef ecosystems, which had been completely destroyed during the extinction event, had slowly begun to re-establish themselves around new types of reef-building organisms. These new reefs were built by creatures that had evolved enhanced tolerance for environmental variability, including temperature fluctuations and changes in water chemistry. The reef communities that emerged were less diverse than their Cretaceous predecessors, but more resilient to the types of environmental disturbances that had become common in the post-impact world. Deep ocean ecosystems had become repositories of biological diversity that served as sources of colonists for surface communities when environmental conditions deteriorated. Many deep-sea organisms had evolved the ability to migrate vertically through the water column, allowing them to track optimal conditions as surface environments changed. These vertical migrations created connections between surface and deep-sea communities that provided stability to the entire marine ecosystem. The atmospheric chemistry that supported all this life had also stabilized into new configurations that reflected the altered carbon and oxygen cycles of the post-impact world. Carbon dioxide levels had gradually declined from their post-impact peaks, but they remained higher than pre-impact levels, supporting enhanced plant growth while maintaining global temperatures that were several degrees warmer than the Cretaceous norm. This enhanced greenhouse effect had been moderated by the expansion of forest cover and the development of more efficient carbon sequestration mechanisms in both terrestrial and marine ecosystems. Oxygen levels had also stabilized at concentrations that were lower than Cretaceous peaks, but adequate to support the smaller-bodied organisms that dominated post-impact ecosystems. The reduced oxygen availability had actually favored the evolution of more efficient respiratory systems and metabolic processes, creating organisms that could extract more energy from each breath than their Mesozoic ancestors. This metabolic efficiency had become one of the defining characteristics of Cenozoic life. Weather patterns had settled into cycles that were more variable than those of the Cretaceous, but more predictable than the chaotic conditions that had characterized the immediate post-impact period. Seasonal temperature ranges were greater than they had been in the Mesozoic, creating distinct seasonal environments that supported different types of biological activity at different times of year. These seasonal patterns had become important drivers of evolutionary innovation, favoring organisms that could adapt their physiology and behavior to changing conditions. Storm systems had also become more intense but less frequent than during the climate chaos period, creating a pattern of environmental disturbance that organisms could anticipate and prepare for. Many species had evolved strategies for surviving severe weather events, from enhanced shelter-seeking behaviors to physiological adaptations that allowed them to endure temporary food shortages or temperature extremes. The survivors had learned to expect the unexpected and to build resilience into every aspect of their biology. The geographic distribution of life had also been transformed by the events of the past 10 million years. Instead of the relatively uniform global climate that had characterized much of the Cretaceous, the post-impact world was characterized by distinct climate zones that supported different types of ecosystems. This climatic diversity had driven the evolution of regional biotas that were adapted to local conditions, but connected by migration corridors that allowed genetic exchange and recolonization after local extinctions. Biogeographic barriers that had not existed during the Cretaceous now separated continental regions and created opportunities for independent evolutionary innovation. Island biogeography had become an important driver of speciation as sea level changes, and tectonic activity created isolated populations that could evolve in different directions. This geographic fragmentation had increased global biodiversity by allowing multiple solutions to evolve for similar ecological challenges. Mountain building and other geological processes had created new types of environments that had not existed during the relatively flat Cretaceous landscape. These mountainous regions had become centers of evolutionary innovation as organisms adapted to the challenges of high altitude, steep slopes, and rapidly changing environmental conditions. The diversity of microhabitats created by complex topography had provided opportunities for ecological specialization that had driven the evolution of new species and ecological relationships. Volcanic activity, which had played such a destructive role during the immediate post-impact period, had also become a source of new opportunities as ecosystems learned to cope with and even benefit from periodic disturbances. Some organisms had evolved to take advantage of the nutrient-rich soils created by volcanic ash, while others had developed strategies for rapidly recolonizing areas that had been sterilized by volcanic activity. The survivors had learned to see disturbance not as catastrophe, but as opportunity. River systems had been reorganized by the climate changes and geological activity of the post-impact period, creating new patterns of connectivity between different ecosystems. These waterways had become corridors for the movement of organisms and genes across landscapes, allowing isolated populations to maintain genetic diversity and providing pathways for recolonization after local extinctions. The health of river ecosystems had become crucial to the stability of entire continental biotas. Coastal environments had also been transformed by sea level changes and altered ocean circulation patterns. New types of marine-terrestrial interfaces had evolved that supported unique communities of organisms adapted to the challenges of living between land and sea. These coastal ecosystems had become important nursery areas for many species and had served as stepping stones for the colonization of offshore islands and continents. As the 10 millionth anniversary of the asteroid impact passed without ceremony or notice, the planet continued its patient work of building new forms of life from the genetic raw material of the survivors. The world that had emerged from the climate catastrophe was smaller in scale and more modest in its ambitions than the magnificent Mesozoic Earth that had been lost, but it was also more resilient, more adaptable, and ultimately more capable of supporting the long-term evolution of complex life. The lessons learned during those terrible years of environmental collapse had been written into the genetic code of every surviving lineage. Flexibility had become more valuable than size. Cooperation had proven more successful than domination. Efficiency had trumped excess. These principles, forged in the crucible of near extinction, would guide the evolution of life on Earth for millions of years to come. In quiet forests and gentle streams, in peaceful meadows and calm seas, the descendants of the survivors continued their ancient work of living, growing, reproducing, and evolving. They carried within their cells the memory of the great dying and the knowledge of how to endure when the world itself seemed to be ending. They were the inheritors of a planet that had been transformed by cosmic violence and climate chaos. But they were also the proof that life, in its infinite creativity and persistence, could find ways to flourish even after the most devastating catastrophes. The slow death of the dinosaurs had ended not with extinction, but with transformation. The climate changes that had eliminated the giants of the Mesozoic had also created the conditions for new forms of life to emerge and prosper. In the end, the asteroid impact had been not just a moment of destruction, but also a moment of creation, marking the transition from one chapter of Earth's story to another. The survivors had written that new chapter with their lives, their adaptations, and their quiet persistence through the darkest times their planet had ever known. And in the gentle warmth of a stabilizing climate, Under skies that had finally cleared of dust and acid, life continued its ancient dance of death and renewal, carried forward by creatures small enough to survive, adaptable enough to change, and resilient enough to build a new world from the ashes of the old. The great climate catastrophe was over, but its lessons lived on in every heartbeat, every breath, and every small act of survival that connected the present to that terrible and transformative moment when the Earth itself had learned to begin again. The morning after the Great Dying began, the first rays of sunlight struggled through an atmosphere thick with particles too small to see, but large enough to alter the fate of every living thing on Earth. Across vast continents where triceratops herds had grazed just days before, a strange twilight settled over landscapes that should have been bathed in warm Cretaceous sunshine. The asteroid had delivered its violent blow and departed back into the cosmic void, but the real destroyer of the dinosaur world was just beginning its work. In the weeks that followed the impact, as fine silicate dust and sulfur compounds circulated through the upper atmosphere, something unprecedented was happening to the very foundation of life itself. Plants, those quiet architects of every terrestrial ecosystem, began to slow their ancient process of converting sunlight into chemical energy. Photosynthesis, the mechanism that had powered Earth's biosphere for billions of years, was grinding to a halt as solar radiation levels dropped by more than half across the entire planet. The particles suspended in the stratosphere were perfectly sized to cause maximum damage to incoming light. Each grain of pulverized rock, each droplet of sulfuric acid, scattered and absorbed the photons that plants desperately needed to survive. What had once been brilliant daylight became a dim, grey illumination that filtered weakly through the particle-laden sky. Even at noon, the world existed in a perpetual state of dusk, as if the sun itself had grown old and tired. In the great conifer forests that had fed countless generations of sauropods, the first signs of collapse appeared in the understory. Ferns that had thrived in the dappled light beneath towering trees began to yellow and wither as their energy reserves ran low. These ancient plants, survivors of countless environmental changes throughout Earth's history, found themselves facing a challenge unlike anything they had evolved to handle. Their fronds, perfectly designed to capture and process sunlight, became useless ornaments in a world where sunlight had become a scarce commodity. The trees themselves took longer to show distress, their massive trunks storing enough energy to sustain them for months. But even these giants were not immune to the creeping darkness. Conifers that had lived for centuries began to shed their needles prematurely, their internal chemistry unable to maintain the complex processes needed for healthy growth. The great canopies that had sheltered dinosaur communities for millions of years started to thin and break apart as individual trees entered states of dormancy from which many would never emerge. Flowering plants, still relatively new to Earth's ecosystems after their explosive diversification during the Cretaceous, proved particularly vulnerable to the extended darkness. Their rapid growth strategies and high metabolic demands left them with little margin for surviving prolonged periods without adequate sunlight. Across the flowering meadows and forest clearings, where hadrosaurs had browsed on nutritious blooms, the colourful displays of Cretaceous flora began to fade into brown monotony, as species after species exhausted their energy reserves and died. The chemical processes that sustained plant life required precise conditions that the impact winter had utterly destroyed. Chlorophyll, the green molecule that captures light energy and begins the transformation into sugar, became increasingly ineffective as photon levels dropped below the threshold needed for efficient photosynthesis. Plants found themselves in the impossible position of requiring more energy to maintain their basic cellular functions than they could extract from the weakened sunlight filtering through the dust-laden atmosphere. As weeks turned to months and the atmospheric dust showed no signs of clearing, entire plant communities began to collapse in cascading waves of death. The ecological relationships that had taken millions of years to develop unraveled with shocking speed as primary producers failed to provide the energy foundation upon which all other life depended. Pollination networks, seed dispersal systems, and nutrient cycling processes all broke down as the plants that supported them withered and died. The herbivorous dinosaurs that depended on these plant communities found themselves facing a crisis that their evolution had never prepared them to handle. Species like Edmontosaurus, which required enormous quantities of plant material every day to fuel their massive digestive systems, began to experience the first stages of malnutrition as their preferred food sources became increasingly scarce and poor in nutritional content. These gentle giants wandered through landscapes that were rapidly becoming biological deserts, searching desperately for the abundant vegetation that had sustained their ancestors for countless generations. Triceratops herds, which had evolved complex social behaviors around seasonal migrations following plant growth patterns, found their ancient roots leading to barren wastelands where no fresh growth appeared. Their powerful beaks, perfectly designed for cropping tough vegetation, now worked overtime to extract minimal nutrition from the dying plants that remained. Adults began losing weight despite spending every waking hour foraging, their massive frames requiring more calories than the deteriorating environment could provide. The smaller herbivorous dinosaurs faced their own unique challenges as the plant collapse continued. Species that had specialized in eating particular types of vegetation found their dietary niches simply disappearing from the ecosystem. Seed-eating dinosaurs discovered that plants were no longer producing viable seeds in sufficient quantities to support their populations. Even the most generalized plant eaters struggled to find adequate nutrition as the overall quality and quantity of available vegetation plummeted throughout the impact winter. Sauropods, those magnificent long-necked giants that had dominated herbivorous niches for over 100 million years, were particularly vulnerable to the plant collapse. Their enormous size required them to consume hundreds of pounds of vegetation daily, and their specialized digestive systems had evolved to process specific types of plant material that were becoming increasingly unavailable. As conifer forests died and fern prairies withered, these gentle titans found themselves in a world that could no longer support their basic biological needs. The social structures of herbivorous dinosaur communities began to break down as the environmental crisis deepened. Family groups that had remained together for years were forced to separate as each individual focused entirely on finding enough food to survive. Parental care, which had been a defining characteristic of many dinosaur species, became a luxury that adults could no longer afford when their own survival was in question. Young animals were abandoned not out of cruelty, but out of the harsh mathematics of energy conservation in a world where calories had become more precious than gold. Migration patterns that had evolved over millions of years became meaningless as herbivorous species discovered that seasonal movement no longer led to better feeding grounds. The environmental collapse was global in scope, and there were no distant territories where plants still thrived and animals could find refuge. The great herds that had once moved across continental distances following the rhythm of seasons found themselves trapped in a world where every direction led to the same devastation. Digestive systems that had been refined over countless generations to extract maximum nutrition from specific plant materials now worked against their owners as the chemical composition of available vegetation changed. Plants stressed by the environmental crisis produce different ratios of nutrients and defensive compounds than healthy vegetation, creating digestive problems for animals whose gut bacteria and internal chemistry were calibrated for normal plant tissues. Even when herbivorous dinosaurs could find plant material to eat, their bodies often struggled to extract adequate nutrition from the altered vegetation. The psychological stress of living in an environment where food was constantly scarce may have been as damaging as the physical effects of malnutrition. Many dinosaur species had evolved complex social behaviors and communication systems that depended on predictable environmental conditions and adequate resources. The breakdown of these social systems would have created additional stress that weakened immune systems and reduced reproductive success, accelerating the decline of already struggling populations. As the impact winter entered its second year, with no sign that atmospheric conditions would improve anytime soon, the herbivorous dinosaur communities that had thrived for millions of years in the stable Cretaceous climate found themselves facing a simple but inexorable mathematical problem. The energy they could extract from their dying environment was no longer sufficient to maintain their population sizes, and there was no evolutionary solution that could develop quickly enough to save them from the slow process of starvation that had begun with the failure of photosynthesis. The carnivorous dinosaurs that had evolved to hunt these herbivorous species initially experienced what might have seemed like a period of abundance. As plant-eating dinosaurs weakened and died from malnutrition, scavenging opportunities increased dramatically for meat-eating species. Tyrannosaurus rex and other apex predators found themselves in landscapes where carcasses were becoming increasingly common, potentially reducing the energy expenditure required for hunting while providing access to substantial food resources. But this apparent bounty was illusory and temporary. The carnivorous dinosaurs were witnessing the collapse of their own food base, even as they benefited from it in the short term. Each herbivorous animal that died from starvation represented not just a meal for scavengers, but also the permanent loss of future reproductive potential that could have sustained predator populations over the long term. The carnivores were essentially consuming the capital rather than the interest of their ecological investment, a strategy that could only lead to their own eventual starvation. Smaller predatory dinosaurs that had specialized in hunting particular types of prey found their dietary niches disappearing as specific herbivorous species went extinct. Raptors that had evolved to hunt in coordinated packs discovered that their prey species were becoming too scattered and weakened to support the complex social hunting strategies that had made these predators successful. Individual hunting became more necessary, but also more difficult, as prey animals became increasingly desperate and unpredictable in their behavior. The largest carnivorous dinosaurs faced unique challenges related to their enormous size and correspondingly massive food requirements. A single adult Tyrannosaurus rex needed to consume several hundred pounds of meat per week to maintain its metabolic needs, and this requirement remained constant even as the availability of suitable prey declined. The energy economics that had made large size advantageous in a world of abundant prey now became a liability in an environment where food sources were rapidly disappearing. Scavenging, which had always been an important supplement to active hunting for many carnivorous species, became increasingly competitive as multiple predator species competed for the same carcasses. The social dynamics of scavenging changed as well, with individual animals becoming more aggressive and less willing to share resources, even with members of their own species. The cooperative behaviors that had characterized many carnivorous dinosaur communities broke down under the pressure of resource scarcity. As the herbivorous populations continued to decline throughout the extended impact winter, the time intervals between successful hunting or scavenging opportunities grew longer and longer for carnivorous species. Predators that had been accustomed to regular meals found themselves going weeks without adequate food, forcing their bodies to metabolize muscle tissue and fat reserves to maintain basic physiological functions. The magnificent physical condition that had made these animals effective hunters gradually deteriorated under the stress of chronic malnutrition. The reproductive cycles of carnivorous dinosaurs were among the first casualties of the food scarcity crisis. Females could no longer accumulate the energy reserves necessary for successful egg production, while males lost the physical condition needed to compete for mates and defend territories. Parental care behaviors, which required enormous energy investments from adults, became impossible when those adults were struggling to meet their own basic metabolic needs. Entire generations of young carnivorous dinosaurs were never born as reproductive success plummeted across all predatory species. Territorial behaviors that had been maintained for millions of years began to break down as individual predators were forced to expand their ranges in search of increasingly scarce prey. Traditional hunting territories that had supported stable predator populations for generations could no longer provide adequate resources for even a single individual. The complex social structures that had regulated competition between carnivorous species collapsed as desperation drove animals to take greater risks and venture into unfamiliar territory in search of food. Cannibalism, which had been rare among most dinosaur species under normal environmental conditions, became more common as carnivorous animals faced starvation. Adults began preying on juveniles of their own species, while weakened individuals became targets for stronger members of their communities. These desperate feeding strategies provided temporary relief from hunger, but further accelerated the collapse of predator populations by eliminating the young animals that represented the future of each species. The specialized hunting adaptations that had made different carnivorous species successful began to work against them as environmental conditions changed. Predators that had evolved to hunt in specific habitats found those habitats altered beyond recognition by the plant collapse and climate changes. Species that had developed particular hunting strategies discovered that their prey no longer behaved in predictable ways, making their carefully honed techniques ineffective or even counterproductive. As the impact winter progressed into its third and fourth years, even the most adaptable carnivorous species found themselves unable to locate adequate prey to sustain their populations. The mathematical inevitability of their situation became clear. In an ecosystem where primary productivity had essentially ceased, there was simply not enough energy flowing through food webs to support large secondary and tertiary consumers. The carnivorous dinosaurs, magnificent though they were, had become evolutionary anachronisms in a world that could no longer sustain the ecological relationships that had supported them for over 100 million years. The death of the great predators was not dramatic or sudden. It was a slow fade that paralleled the decline of their herbivorous prey, a gradual weakening that occurred over months and years, as individual animals slowly starved in a world that had become too impoverished to support their magnificent complexity. The apex predators that had ruled terrestrial ecosystems since the Triassic period were quietly eliminated, not by competition from other predators, but by the simple absence of the environmental abundance that had made their existence possible. Meanwhile, in the waters that surrounded the dying continents, an even more rapid and complete ecological collapse was unfolding beneath the surface of the increasingly acidic seas. Marine ecosystems, which had supported some of Earth's most spectacular life forms throughout the Mesozoic era, were experiencing a catastrophic failure that began at the microscopic level and cascaded upward through every level of the oceanic food web with devastating efficiency. The impact winter that had darkened terrestrial environments had an equally profound effect on marine primary productivity. Phytoplankton, the microscopic organisms that formed the absolute foundation of all ocean life, required sunlight for photosynthesis, just as much as land plants did. As the atmospheric dust and sulfur compounds blocked solar radiation from reaching Earth's surface, they also prevented light from penetrating into the surface waters where these crucial organisms lived and reproduced. Unlike terrestrial plant communities, which included trees and other long-lived species that could survive for months on stored energy reserves, marine phytoplankton communities were composed primarily of single-celled organisms with lifespans measured in days or weeks. These organisms had no significant energy storage capacity and required continuous photosynthesis to maintain their populations. When sunlight levels dropped below the threshold needed for effective photosynthesis, phytoplankton populations began to crash almost immediately, creating a cascade of effects that would rapidly destroy the entire structure of marine ecosystems. The collapse of phytoplankton populations removed the primary energy source for zooplankton, the tiny animals that fed on these microscopic plants, and formed the next level of the marine food web. Without adequate phytoplankton to eat, zooplankton populations began to decline rapidly, further reducing the food available for the small fish and other organisms that depended on them. The effect moved up through the food web with mathematical precision, eliminating each trophic level in sequence as the energy foundation of marine life simply disappeared. Ocean acidification, caused by sulfuric acid, formed in the atmosphere and subsequently deposited in marine environments, added another devastating factor to the marine crisis. The pH levels of seawater dropped significantly as acid rain and direct atmospheric deposition altered ocean chemistry on a global scale. This acidification made it extremely difficult for organisms that built shells or skeletons from calcium carbonate to maintain their protective structures, effectively dissolving the homes and armor of countless marine species. Ammonites, those beautiful spiral-shelled cephalopods that had dominated marine environments for hundreds of millions of years, found their shells literally dissolving in the increasingly acidic seawater. These intelligent and adaptable creatures, which had survived multiple previous extinction events, discovered that their most fundamental adaptation had become a liability in the chemically altered post-impact oceans. Their shells, which had provided protection and buoyancy control for countless generations, began to weaken and dissolve as ocean pH levels dropped beyond their tolerance range. The massive marine reptiles that had ruled Mesozoic seas faced their own unique set of challenges as marine food webs collapsed around them. Plesiosaurs, with their long necks and specialized feeding adaptations, had evolved to hunt fish and squid in productive marine environments where prey was abundant and predictable. As fish populations crashed due to the failure of marine primary productivity, these magnificent predators found themselves in vast oceanic deserts where suitable prey had simply vanished. Mosasaurs, the enormous marine lizards that had become the apex predators of Cretaceous seas, faced similar challenges as their preferred prey species disappeared from marine ecosystems. These powerful swimmers required enormous quantities of food to fuel their massive bodies and high-energy hunting strategies. But the collapsed marine food webs could no longer provide the resources needed to sustain such large predators. The rulers of the ancient oceans found themselves slowly starving in seas that had become biological wastelands. Sea turtles, which had already evolved many of the adaptations that would allow some species to survive the extinction event, faced severe challenges as their feeding grounds were destroyed by the marine ecosystem collapse. Species that fed primarily on marine vegetation found their food sources dying as underwater plant communities succumbed to reduced light levels and altered water chemistry. Those that fed on jellyfish and other soft-bodied marine animals discovered that these prey species were also declining rapidly as the base of marine food webs disappeared. The death of marine ecosystems was actually more rapid and complete than the collapse of terrestrial environments. On land, there were at least some stored energy sources in the form of seeds, nuts, dead plant material, and soil organic matter that could sustain some organisms for extended periods. In marine environments, when the phytoplankton died, there was essentially nothing to replace them as an energy source. The ocean became a vast three-dimensional desert where life could persist only in isolated refugia or in the deep-sea environments that were less dependent on surface productivity. Marine food webs that had taken millions of years to develop and refine their complex interactions collapsed in a matter of months, as the environmental foundation that supported them simply ceased to exist. The intricate relationships between predators and prey, the specialized feeding strategies that had allowed different species to coexist, and the seasonal migration patterns that had connected distant marine habitats, all became meaningless in an ocean where the basic energy sources had disappeared. Coral reefs, which had been important marine ecosystems throughout much of the Mesozoic era, were completely eliminated by the combination of reduced light levels, ocean acidification, and elevated water temperatures. The symbiotic relationships between coral polyps and their photosynthetic partner organisms broke down as both partners struggled to survive in the altered marine environment. These diverse and productive ecosystems, which had supported countless species of fish, invertebrates, and marine plants, became underwater graveyards, where bleached coral skeletons mark the sites of vanished communities. The few marine organisms that managed to survive the initial collapse were primarily those that had access to alternative food sources, or could enter dormant states during the worst of the environmental crisis. Deep-sea communities that depended on chemosynthesis rather than photosynthesis continued to function, though at reduced levels. Some fish species survived by retreating to freshwater environments where conditions remained more stable, while others persisted in small refugial populations that would later serve as the founders for post-extinction marine communities. Freshwater environments provided crucial refugia for many aquatic organisms during the marine collapse. Rivers and lakes maintained more stable chemical conditions than the oceans, and often retained some primary productivity even when marine systems had completely failed. The organisms that survived in these freshwater refugia would play crucial roles in the eventual recovery of aquatic ecosystems, serving as sources of genetic diversity and evolutionary innovation for the post-extinction world. As the impact winter continued to grip both terrestrial and marine environments, the planet had become a world where the fundamental processes that support complex life had essentially ceased to function. Photosynthesis, the process that had powered Earth's biosphere for billions of years, had been reduced to minimal levels by the atmospheric dust and chemical pollution created by the asteroid impact. The intricate food webs that had supported the incredible diversity of Mesozoic life had collapsed from the bottom up, eliminating first the primary producers, then the herbivores, and finally the carnivores that had depended on them. Yet even in this devastated world, life persisted in small pockets and isolated refugia where conditions remained marginally tolerable. These survivors, unremarkable though they seemed compared to the magnificent dinosaurs and marine reptiles that were disappearing, carried within their genes the potential for the evolutionary innovations that would eventually rebuild Earth's ecosystems. They were the quiet inheritors of a planet that had been transformed by cosmic violence and climate catastrophe, and their descendants would spend the next several million years slowly reconstructing the web of life from the fragments that remained. The impact winter that had destroyed the Mesozoic world would eventually end as atmospheric dust settled out of the stratosphere and sulfur compounds were gradually removed by natural processes. But when the skies finally cleared and sunlight returned to Earth's surface, it would illuminate a planet that had been fundamentally transformed by the greatest climate catastrophe in its history. The age of dinosaurs was ending not with a bang, but with a long, slow whisper of extinction that would continue for years as the last survivors of the Mesozoic world gradually succumbed to environmental conditions that no longer supported their magnificent complexity. The world that would emerge from this climate catastrophe would be built around different principles than the stable, abundant Mesozoic Earth that had been lost. It would be a world of smaller organisms with more modest requirements, more flexible lifestyles, and greater resilience to environmental change. The survivors would inherit not just a planet, but also the evolutionary lessons learned during the greatest environmental crisis in Earth's history. Lessons that would guide the development of life for the next 66 million years. As the planet slowly emerged from its climate-induced nightmare, roughly 500,000 years after that fateful morning over the Yucatan, Earth had become something entirely unprecedented in its 4 billion-year history. The survivors that inherited this transformed world were not the magnificent giants that had ruled for so long, but humble creatures whose very modesty had become their salvation. They moved through landscapes that bore no resemblance to the abundant Mesozoic world their ancestors had known, yet they carried within their cells the accumulated wisdom of survival through the greatest environmental catastrophe their planet had ever witnessed. The mammals that emerged from their underground refugia were unremarkable by any measure that would have mattered in the Cretaceous world. Most weighed no more than a few hundred grams, their small bodies covered in fur that had evolved not for beauty, but for the practical necessity of maintaining body temperature during the unpredictable climate swings of the post-impact era. Their large eyes reflected adaptations to low light conditions, developed during the long years when normal daylight had become a memory rather than a daily reality. These early mammals moved with the quick, nervous energy of creatures that had learned never to take environmental stability for granted. Their metabolisms had been fine-tuned by natural selection to extract maximum nutrition from minimal food sources, and their reproductive strategies emphasized rapid breeding cycles that could take advantage of brief favorable periods. They were not built for dominance or spectacle, but for persistence and adaptability in a world where both had become essential for survival. The birds that inherited the Cenozoic skies were equally modest in their ambitions. Gone were the giant pterosaurs that had soared over Cretaceous landscapes on wings spanning the width of small aircraft. The surviving birds were predominantly ground-dwelling species that had learned to find sustenance in the detritus and seeds that remained available even when normal ecosystems had collapsed. Their ability to fly, while crucial for survival during the climate crisis, was now used primarily for short-distance movements between patchy food sources, rather than the continent-spanning migrations that had characterized some Mesozoic species. These avian survivors had evolved beaks and digestive systems capable of processing the hard seeds and tough plant materials that became the primary food sources during ecosystem recovery. Their rapid metabolisms, while energy expensive, allowed them to remain active in the variable temperatures that characterized the post-impact climate. They were the living continuation of the dinosaur lineage, but in forms so reduced and specialized that they seemed to belong to an entirely different world than their magnificent ancestors. The reptilian survivors represented an even more dramatic departure from Mesozoic norms. Crocodilians had endured the climate catastrophe by retreating to freshwater refugia, where temperatures remained more stable and food sources persisted longer than in terrestrial or marine environments. Their cold-blooded physiology, which had been a disadvantage during the coldest years of the impact winter, now proved remarkably suited to the variable climate conditions of the recovery period. These surviving crocodilians were generally smaller and more conservative in their ecological requirements than their Cretaceous relatives. They had learned to survive on minimal food intake during harsh periods and to take advantage of favorable conditions when they occurred. Their long lifespans meant that individual animals could potentially survive multiple environmental crises, accumulating experience that could be passed on to their offspring through behavioral learning. Turtles had survived through a combination of protective adaptations and flexible lifestyles that proved perfectly suited to the unstable post-impact world. Their shells provided physical protection during environmental chaos, while their ability to slow their metabolisms allowed them to endure extended periods with minimal food. Many surviving turtle species were omnivorous, capable of switching between plant and animal food sources as availability changed, and their tolerance for a wide range of environmental conditions made them remarkably resilient to the climate instability that characterized the recovery period. Snakes and lizards that survived were generally small species with low metabolic requirements and highly flexible diets. They had learned to exploit food sources that larger predators could not access, feeding on insects, small mammals, and other organisms that remained available, even when larger prey had become scarce. Their reproductive strategies emphasized producing large numbers of offspring with minimal parental investment, allowing populations to recover quickly from environmental setbacks. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this new world was not any individual species, but the fundamentally different principles that governed how ecosystems functioned. The post-impact biosphere had been rebuilt around concepts of resilience rather than efficiency, flexibility rather than specialization, and cooperation rather than competition. These were lessons written in the genetic code of every surviving lineage, taught by the harsh mathematics of survival during the greatest environmental crisis in Earth's history. Plant communities that emerged during the recovery period were dominated by species that could reproduce rapidly and colonize disturbed habitats quickly. Flowering plants which had been diversifying throughout the Cretaceous, proved particularly well suited to the unstable conditions of the post-impact world. Their rapid growth rates and efficient reproductive strategies allowed them to take advantage of brief, favorable periods and to recover quickly from environmental setbacks. The forests that slowly developed were characterized by deciduous trees that could shed their leaves during unfavorable seasons, conserving energy and resources until conditions improved. These trees formed canopies that were more open than the dense Cretaceous forests, allowing light to reach understory plants and creating more diverse vertical habitat structure. The plant communities that emerged were less productive in terms of total biomass than their Mesozoic predecessors, but they were also more stable and resilient to environmental disturbance. Pollination networks were rebuilt around partnerships that emphasized redundancy and flexibility rather than specialization. Most flowering plants could be pollinated by multiple insect species, while most pollinators could visit multiple plant species, creating webs of relationships that could withstand the loss of individual partners. This redundancy came at a cost in terms of efficiency, but it provided insurance against future environmental disruptions. Seed dispersal mechanisms also evolved to include multiple pathways for moving plant genes across landscapes. Wind dispersal, water dispersal, and animal dispersal all played important roles, ensuring that plant populations could respond rapidly to environmental changes by colonizing new habitats or escaping from deteriorating conditions. The plants that thrived in this new world were those that had learned to hedge their evolutionary bets across multiple strategies. Insect communities played crucial roles in rebuilding terrestrial ecosystems, their rapid reproductive cycles allowing populations to expand quickly as environmental conditions permitted. Many insect species had survived the impact winter in dormant stages, emerging years later to find a world with abundant opportunities for colonization. Their diverse feeding strategies meant they could take advantage of almost any available organic matter, from dead plant material to living tissue from other organisms. Decomposer insects became particularly important during the recovery period, processing the vast quantities of organic debris that had accumulated during the ecosystem collapse. These insects converted dead plant and animal material into nutrients that could be used by recovering plant communities, essentially recycling the biomass of the extinct Cretaceous world into building blocks for new Cenozoic life. Their activities helped accelerate soil development and nutrient cycling in landscapes that had been stripped of normal biological processes. Soil communities that developed during the recovery period were extraordinarily complex, reflecting the crucial importance of below-ground processes in maintaining ecosystem stability. Mycorrhizal fungi formed partnerships with plant roots that were more extensive than anything that had existed before the impact, creating underground networks that helped plants access nutrients and water while providing communication pathways that allowed plant communities to coordinate their responses to environmental changes. Bacterial communities in recovering soils also became more diverse, creating multiple pathways for nutrient cycling and organic matter decomposition. This microbial diversity provided insurance against the failure of any single decomposition pathway and ensured that nutrients would continue to cycle even during periods of environmental stress. The invisible world of soil organisms became the foundation upon which all terrestrial life depended. Freshwater environments served as crucial stepping stones for the recolonization of terrestrial and marine habitats. Rivers and lakes that had maintained relatively stable conditions during the climate crisis became sources of colonists for recovering ecosystems. The organisms that had survived in these aquatic refugia often showed adaptations to variable environmental conditions that proved valuable as they expanded into the recovering terrestrial world. The story of the dinosaurs' extinction is ultimately not a tale of cosmic violence, but of climate's quiet persistence. The asteroid that struck Earth 66 million years ago delivered its blow in moments, but the environmental changes it triggered unfolded across centuries and millennia, reshaping our planet with the patient thoroughness that only climate can achieve. In those transformed landscapes where mammals now scurried through fern-covered clearings and birds sang from the branches of flowering trees. The lessons of survival had been written into the very fabric of life itself. The creatures that inherited this new Earth carried within their genes the hard-won knowledge of endurance through environmental chaos, flexibility in the face of uncertainty, and the profound understanding that in a world where climate can change everything, adaptation is the only constant. The slow death of the dinosaurs became the quiet birth of our modern world, proving that sometimes the most profound transformations happen not in moments of dramatic destruction, but in the patient accumulation of small changes that eventually remake everything. Climate, it turns out, is the ultimate author of Earth's story, writing each chapter with the deliberate care of deep time itself.